Okay, guess we are ready to start. Good afternoon and welcome to today's seminar in Sustainable Developments. As you all have seen, we have a great topic. Population bomb, diffused, are still ticking. We have a great panel and a great moderator. And I just briefly want to introduce John Mutter, who will lead through today's session. John is a professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences. His training actually was in the field of geophysics, but since then he moved on to many topics related to sustainable development. He is now also jointly appointed as professor in the Department of Public Policy and Affairs at SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs. And he is the director of the PhD program in sustainable development. So John will make some introductory remarks, then introduce the panel and lead through this session. Please welcome John Mutter.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very pleased to introduce this session and particularly our distinguished group of speakers. I am not myself a population expert or a demographer of any sort. I think there are three reasons why I have the privilege to lead this and moderate this session. One is in the Earth Institute faculty, I suggested the topic for the session. The second is, to a certain extent, I think about populations in that I study the role that natural disasters play in economic and social welfare, what perturbations they may have, the opportunities they may give or inhibit in the creation of welfare. And of course, the more people we have on the planet, the more disasters there are likely to be. Disasters are people-focused events. Hazards are physically focused events. But the third reason, and it's probably the most important, is that I'm brutal in keeping speakers on time. Absolutely. I'll cut people off in mid-sentence. No, I won't. But I'd like to try to keep things on time. What I'd like to do, we have four speakers. We'll introduce them in order, actually in alphabetical order. And we'll have questions at the end of the four, and I'll moderate those questions. I'll introduce each of the speakers individually, but there'll be questions at the end of the four-speaker session. If you've even glanced at their resumes, you'll be impressed. I did a quick little bit of arithmetic and tried to add up the number of years cumulatively this panel has been associated with studies in demographics, a number of them relentlessly through their entire career, completely focused on these problems. And it's very easy to get to 100 years. And because the resumes are a little bit vague in some places, it's not quite possible to get an absolutely accurate estimate of how long they've been doing this, but mine is 121 years for the panel as a whole. That's extraordinary. And these people have not only been in this sort of field for that long, they've been at the top institutions in the world that concern themselves with this very important issue. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to briefly introduce the first speaker, who's John Bongartz. I'm not going to read the full resume, just a couple of the highlights because you have it printed. So he is Population Council Vice President and Distinguished Scholar, and some of it will be set up there, and has worked at the Council since 1973. That was my first part of the arithmetic. His research focuses on the determinants of fertility, population-environment relations, the demographic impact of the AIDS epidemic, population aging, and population policy options in the developing world. He studied fertility issues, and prevailing interests throughout his 30-year career have helped develop countries construct comprehensive population policies, including family planning programs. He's chairman of the panel on population projections of the National Academy of Sciences, member of the US National Academy of Sciences. He received the Robert Lapman Award in 1997, I beg your pardon, and many other distinguished achievements. Could I ask you to come to the microphone, please?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As you all know, the world is going through a period of extraordinarily rapid demographic change. The most obvious example of that is the rise in human numbers. We've added 4 billion to the planet since 1960, and growth continues. There are a number of other important demographic trends. People are living longer and healthier lives. Birth rates are dropping around the world as women are using more and more contraception. Individuals are moving from rural to urban areas and from one country to another in search of a better life. And populations are aging. So this is a large set of activities and interests that keeps demographers like me busy. Today I have only a few minutes, so I'm going to focus on population growth. And I've divided my talk into 3 parts. I'll begin with a quick overview of population trends at the global and regional level, and then comment on policy makers' interest in population, which has gone up and down over time. Fortunately, it's coming up now again, but it has been down for a while. And then finally, I'll summarize briefly what we can do if we're concerned about rapid population growth. And in this case, the focus will be on family planning programs, or there are, of course, other options as well. So the next slide shows the trend. The red line shows the trend for the global total from 1900 to 2010, and then projections from the United Nations to 2100. So world population stood at 1.8 billion in 1900. It grew slowly to 2.5 billion in 1950, and then it accelerated. And the reason for this acceleration is not a rise in the birth rate, but a decline in the death rate. In particularly in developing countries, when public health technology was exported from the West to the South, antibiotics, vaccines, and so on. That period has lasted till today. We're now at 7 billion, and the UN expects this trend to continue, eventually leveling off at 10.2 billion. So we're still on the steep part of the curve, although there's light at the end of the tunnel several decades away. There are regional trends here as well, and by far the largest region is Asia. It has tripled in size since 1950. But over the next few decades it's expected to level off and perhaps even decline. And the reason for this slowing down is that fertility has come down, particularly in China, of course, with the one-child policy, but also in India and Bangladesh and Indonesia, some of the largest countries. Africa, the blue line is Africa, which is at the moment is a relatively small part of the world. But it's growing extraordinarily rapidly. So today it's 900 million population, is expected to reach 3.5 billion, so an increase of 2.5 billion. And then Europe, Latin and North America are relatively small on this scale and fairly stable. So the bottom line is that the world is expected to add 3.2 billion more people. Most of them will be in Africa. And I should add, in Africa, most African increases will be in urban rather than rural areas. And since urban areas are not well equipped to handle 3 billion more people, most of them are going to end up in slums. So if you, in one line, the majority of people are going to be added to the world are going to end up in slums in Africa. Now, the next slide shows the country variation in growth rates. You can see the African center here, very high growth rates, also the Middle East, Pakistan and Afghanistan. Then there are intermediate levels in South Asia, North Africa and parts of Latin America. And then low growth in most of the developed world, North America, Europe, Japan. In fact, there are now a few countries where population growth is negative. And that's a whole other story. Some people claim that the population explosion is being replaced by a population implosion. That is simply not the case on a global basis. There are some countries, though, where population growth is turning negative. So why does this matter? Well, there's a large number of reasons I've listed here. The one that I think you are most familiar with are the environmental impact of rapid population growth. That means a depletion of natural resources, water, land, forest, and so on. Climate change is in part due to rapid population growth, pollution of air, water, and soil, etc. So there's a host of environmental factors that are affected. There are, in addition, several other reasons why we should be concerned about population growth and high fertility. At the economic level, lots of new people entering the labor force are competing for jobs, and that depresses wages. It contributes to unemployment, poverty, and inequality. The governmental level, we see countries throughout the developing world simply keep unable to cope with the large number of people being added. So we have inadequate investments in education, health service, and infrastructure. I've seen schools that where there were no room for the students, so they sat outside under a tree, and there are 150 students per class. So that is how education is now being done in many of these poor countries. Health, high birth rates raise mortality because every time you have a pregnancy you are at risk of dying. And then on the political level, having large numbers of young unemployed men is a recipe for social and political unrest. Now, this list, I think, hopefully impresses you, and it has also impressed policymakers around the world. And interest in population growth began in the 60s and 70s when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book, Population Explosion. We had the oil price shocks, you had food, you had famines in poor countries. And massive investments were made in family planning programs in the developing world. So at that time, population was high on the global agenda. But over time, interest has waned, and by the 90s, funding had dropped, interest had dropped, and actually very little attention given to population. Now, fortunately, it's coming back now. So let me briefly comment on why, in the last few years, there's a sudden resurgence of interest in this field. And the first, and I think most important perhaps, is the sub-Saharan Africa, by recent projection, is adding 1 billion by 2050, and 2.5 billion by the year 2100. And this is despite the AIDS epidemic. In the 90s, leading environmentalists projected that the AIDS epidemic would be so severe that the population of Africa would either stabilize or might even decline. And that has turned out not to be the case. The AIDS epidemic has peaked, and certainly many people have died from AIDS, but population growth has enormous momentum, and therefore population growth has only been marginally affected. And in the 1990s, funding was moved from family planning programs to AIDS programs, and there's now realization that the neglect of family planning programs has been a mistake. Then we have environmental concerns, which waned in the 1990s, have come back. Global warming is now much clearer and much more widely accepted. And we have recent spikes in food and energy prices to very high levels. So these are clear signs that we're approaching environmental limits. Then economists have discovered what's called the demographic bonus. This is important because economists have enormous influence with governments in the developing world. If economists say population doesn't matter, not much is going to happen. Now there's a consensus that there is what is called the demographic bonus. By that I mean a boost to economic growth that results from a decline in birth rate. So with a decline in birth rate, you have fewer young people, you have more workers, and that is good for the economy. And then finally, since 9/11, there's this concern about political and economic consequences of youth bulges, meaning large numbers of young people. Now, how justified this is another matter, but this is certainly one of the rationales for why this issue is coming back. So now let me turn to what we can do if we have actually decided that this is an issue that matters and we want to make a difference. There are basically two general approaches. One is to invest in family planning programs, and I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes because they are the most obvious thing to do. And there's what's called beyond family planning measures, such as girls' education and other things that are also important, and together they can lead to an optimal response to programs. But let me just focus for now on family planning programs. The purpose of a family planning program is to provide information about and access to contraception, to build clinics, to give women access to different methods, to have trained staff that can insert IUDs and provide health advice. The purpose of doing that is to reduce what's called the unmet need for contraception. By unmet need, I mean that there are women out there who would like to use contraception but are not using it now. And then, if you reduce the unmet need, you reduce unplanned pregnancies and their adverse consequences, including population growth. So let's see what this looks like in a particular country. Ethiopia is one of the poorest and largest countries in Africa. And I've plotted here data that come from surveys in which women were interviewed about their contraceptive use and their needs. So from 2000, 2005, and 2011. Women were asked, married women, whether they were using contraception, and the answer was that 8% were using contraception. They were then asked whether they wanted to get pregnant now, or soon. And the answer was that 43% or so said they didn't want to get pregnant. Only 8% were actually doing something about that intention not to get pregnant. So you have what is called an unmet need of somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of women who don't want to get pregnant are not using contraception. Now, the government is aware of this and has built a family planning program in recent years that has outreach to all the rural areas. And as you can see, contraceptive use has risen sharply, especially for such a poor country, and it's now about 30%. This means that about half of the demand is met by contraceptive use, but about the other half is still unmet need. So they've made progress, but they still have a long way to go. The consequence of unmet need, of course, is that there are unplanned pregnancies. And here is a summary of the East African situation. The size of the bar is 100% of all pregnancies. The planning status, pregnancy is either unintended or intended, and roughly 45% of pregnancies are unintended and the remaining are intended. Now, here's the outcomes of these pregnancies. So, intended pregnancies and an intended birth, unintended pregnancies and either an abortion or an unintended birth. About half of unintended births and in abortions. So, clearly, it would be desirable to have these events not occur. And that is the reason, rationale for implementing family planning programs. Now, do family planning programs work? There's been a controversy over this, but I think the consensus now is that family planning programs really can make a difference. And the most famous and most important experiment in this area was done in Bangladesh starting in the 70s. At that time, Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, and the government wanted to implement family planning programs, but they weren't sure whether it would work. So they took a rural district called Matlab, and divided it in half. The experimental area, about 100,000 people got high-quality services, a choice of methods, as well as outreach to the villages and the houses where women lived. The control area got nothing except the existing very low-quality government program. And you can see what happened. Within a year from the start of this experiment, a third of women used contraception. And so this was clearly a success. And the finding of this experiment led the government to implement this approach that was tested in this experiment to all of Bangladesh. And the result is seen here best by comparing Bangladesh and Pakistan. Pakistan has not had such a strong program. Bangladesh has. These two countries were, of course, together in one country in the early 70s when it broke up. You can see Bangladesh has a much more rapid decline in fertility than Pakistan. So the one result of this event is decline in the birth rate. Here are some other beneficial effects of addressing unmet need for contraception. For the developing world as a whole, funding family planning would reduce and reducing unmet need would eliminate 23 million unplanned births, 22 million abortions, 7 million miscarriages, 1.4 million infant deaths, 142,000 pregnancy-related deaths of mothers, and 505,000 fewer children losing their mothers. So these are the health effects, and there are additional economic and environmental effects which I cannot go into right now. One final graph I want to show is that a small effect, the effect of family planning programs on fertility is about a birth or so. And then the question is, what does that reduction in fertility do to population growth? And this slide intends to show that effect. So the red line is the sub-Saharan African population, which has quadrupled since 1950. It's now 0.86 billion. And the red line is the median projection of the UN, which ends up at about 3.5 million. Now, this median projection includes a substantial decline in fertility. If fertility does not decline in Africa, we have this trajectory. This is a constant fertility trajectory, which would mean that Africa would reach 8 billion in 2050 or so. A totally unacceptable and implausible trend. The medium is the most likely trend, but of course there's uncertainty about this, and the UN gives two alternative projections, one high and the other low. The only difference between the high and the low variance is that the fertility level is increased by 0.5% compared to the medium, half a birth, and the low is half a birth below the medium. And as you can see, if we can just reduce the birth rate by half a birth more, the impact is about 1 billion. So the message here is that a small effect on birth fertility have huge long-term consequences for population growth. All right, to summarize then, the population size of the poorest countries is expected to double, so the population bomb is not at all over. The population explosion continues in the poor countries. There are a wide range of adverse health, socioeconomic, environmental, and political consequences, and we have a range of policy options, namely to strengthen family planning and reproductive health programs, and beyond family planning measures such as investing in girls' education. Thank you very much.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, we'll go to our next speaker and have questions at the end of the 4 speakers. The next, the next speaker is known to many of us. It's Joel Cohen, who's jointly appointed here at Columbia and at Rockefeller. And, excuse me again. We know him, many of us know him for actually one of his 2 books. The 2 books are mentioned in the little resume here. One of them is called Comparison of Stochastic Matrices with Application in Information Theory, Statistics, Economics, and Population Science. And I'm sure it's a page-turner, but the one that really is a page-turner is How Many People Can the World Support?, which is a wonderful book that I recommend to all of you. I won't tell you the answer. Maybe Joel will. He's a delightful colleague here at Columbia, the Earth Institute. He's won many prizes. I'll mention only one. That is the SOPA Prize awarded by the Pan American Health and Education Foundation for his work on Chagas disease. I should perhaps also mention that he's co-winner of the Tyler Prize. Joel, please.
Thank you, John, for inviting me to participate. Thank you, fellow speakers, for making this a distinguished occasion. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out on a beautiful afternoon to sit in a lightless, airless room for the sake of learning and saving the world. People affect the climate affects people. The only non-obvious contribution I would like to add to those remarks is that the interaction between climate and people is not a two-way street, but is affected by economics and culture, including institutions, values, laws, traditions, what people want out of life. To visualize that, I make a triangular tetrahedron with economics, culture, and environment at the base and population at the top. Whoops, I'm going to go back. How do I get this pointer? Is that the middle thing? Ah, good, thank you. So between population and climate, this interaction between people and the environment is modulated by how both of them interact with economics and how culture interacts with all three. And to think in terms of a two-way street here is far too simple for reality. The bottom line of that perspective is that solving problems of climate change will be difficult or impossible without addressing rapid population growth where it occurs, urbanization and aging. John has spoken about rapid population growth. Mark will talk about urbanization. And I'll discuss a little bit about aging. Solving those problems, population problems, will not solve many of the problems of climate change. Population affects climate change, but is not all that matters. That's my bottom line. You can sleep now. Population affects climate. Humans alter the climate in three ways: by emitting greenhouse gases, GHG, and I'm going to focus on that way only, by altering the planetary albedo, which is how much of the incoming energy it reflects back into space, by changing the land area covered by forest, snow and ice, desert, asphalt, concrete. To be concrete, so to speak, a black surface like asphalt or the dark surface of green-leafed conifers absorbs much more energy than a white surface like an ice flow. And a diminution in the ice cover of the Arctic increases the energy absorbed by the Earth. And the third way is by altering atmospheric components such as ozone and sulfuric acid particles, which affect cloud cover. Cloud cover reflects the light. It doesn't get down to the land surface. But I'm only going to talk about greenhouse gases, and very briefly. John has already told you the four big trends of the human population over the next half century to century. It's getting bigger, it's growing more slowly as a result of fertility decline, it's getting older, and it's getting more urban. And I'd just like to show you some pictures. The population is this blue curve here from the year 0 or 1 to the year 2000. This is on a logarithmic scale. So we have 100 million here, 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, and so on. If human populations grew exponentially, this would be a straight line. Whatever the slope would be, it would be straight. I invite you to consider whether that looks straight to you. It doesn't look straight to me, which means that population grew not exponentially, but super exponentially, with a rate of increase that was increasing as the population size grew, up until about 1960, and then this blue curve turns over when fertility began to fall. So human population growth has never been exponential and is not now. While population was growing a doubling time of 15 centuries from, let's say, 250 million to 500 million, the GDP was virtually constant. GDP per person, was virtually constant until around 1800. Then there was an industrial revolution, and the GDP per person took off at a rate of increase that was higher. You can see the slope here for the dashed green line is higher than the blue. The total GDP is the product of the population size, which was growing super exponentially, and the GDP per person, which was growing super exponentially. From the point of view of our planetary systems, it's the total GDP that matters, because that is the scale on which we affect the environment, including climate. From the point of view of the individual, it's the GDP per person that matters, because people are concerned about their own well-being. What drove that industrial revolution? It was partly a revolution in knowledge and technology, and substantially a revolution in energy production. Biomass is burning of wood, plant wastes, and dung. And that has been continuing, but at a low level, while gas, oil, and coal have provided the bulk of the energy increase. The consequence of that combustion of fossil fuels and carbon-containing fuels has been a dramatic increase in carbon dioxide, the most common greenhouse gas. Well, I guess water vapor is the commonest greenhouse gas, but after that, carbon dioxide. Then methane, which is per molecule much more potent as a greenhouse gas, and nitrous oxide. And you can see explosions within the last 2 centuries in the atmospheric concentrations of these gases. So let's try to put a few numbers on this just so we find out orders of magnitude what matters. John, could you tell me exactly how many minutes I have left? I want to be sure that I stop. Okay. I think I have a little bit, maybe. Okay. So between 1900 and 2000, the GDP per person increased a little bit less than 5-fold, while the world population, the number I had was 1.6. John said 1.8, so I have to get up to date and find out where that number came from. Increased a little bit less than 4-fold. So a little bit less than 4-fold for population times a little bit less than 5-fold for income per person is a little bit less than 20. And the size of the world economy grew 18-fold, much faster than the rate of increase in population. So it's economic growth that is driving the production of energy, or vice versa. They're going together. And population is responsible for part of that increase, but not for the lion's share. It's responsible for a substantial share. The carbon emitted to the atmosphere by humans went up 15-fold, water withdrawals 8-fold, nitrogen and NOx from fossil fuels 20-fold, while population grew 4-fold. Numbers matter, but that ain't all that matters. Greenhouse gas emissions per person depend on how cities are built. I will leave that to Mark. The size of households, which depends partly on fertility, the age of the household head, income, technology, and values. If I want to go outside and have a good time, do I go bird watching or do I get on a snowmobile? The fossil fuel consequences are very different. This is the only slide that has a non-obvious message. And so I invite you to take a minute with me and look at the numbers carefully. She is an economist at the World Bank who collected 93 countries, 29 of them in the high-income group and 64 in the middle and low-income groups. Here are the millions of metric tons of carbon emitted in 1975 and 1996. That increased 27% for the rich countries, whereas the population over this same interval increased 16%. Okay? For the poor countries, carbon emissions grew 140%. From a much lower base, whereas in the rich countries, carbon emissions grew, population, in the developing countries, 140% increase in carbon and a 49% increase in population. Okay? The global average is 61% increase in carbon, 43% in population. Notice that the 61 is intermediate between the 27 and the 140, as you would expect for a global average. And the 43% for the increase in population is between the 16 and the 49, again as you would expect, but closer to the 49 of the poor countries because most of the world's people live in these poorer countries. That's all intuitively plausible. Now, economists measure, in many cases, the impact of one variable on another by means of an elasticity. So the elasticity of carbon emissions as a function of population is the percent change in carbon emissions for each percent change in population. That's elasticity. So let's do a crude estimate of elasticity. For the developed countries, it's 27 divided by 16, or 1.6. For each 10% increase in population, you would have a 16% increase in carbon emissions. That's what the 1.6 means. For the poor countries, you have an elasticity of 2.8. For each 10% increase in population of the poor countries, you would have a 28% increase in carbon emissions. Are you with me so far? Now here comes the crunch. Look at the totals. The elasticity for the world is 61 divided by 4.3. It's 1.4. For a 10% increase in world population on total, you'd have a 14% increase in carbon emissions. The 1.4 is not between the 1.6 and the 2.8. There ain't no magic in these numbers. I'm trying to convey to you that global figures on the elasticity of carbon in response to population are profoundly misleading because they aggregate completely different processes operating at different speeds. And if you really absorb that message, I've done my job. And if you really understand it, then you should ask yourself, well, just a minute, are all developing countries the same? Actually, they're not. So this 2.8 is an aggregation of data at a lower level. And how do you decide where to stop? That's not clear. I just want to give you a preventive immunization against believing global figures when they are not linear figures that aggregate as your intuition might expect. Global averages mislead. Okay, so I've talked about the impact of total population. I want to talk briefly about fertility. This is the history of the world's fertility. And again, the global average, 1950 here, the global average is a misleading summary. The rich countries were already very low and continued to drop but have been resurgent, while the poor countries have gone through an exceptionally rapid drop in the average number of children per woman per lifetime. Worldwide, it went from 5 to about 2.5. But China is at 1.6 or so, lower than Europe, or the same ballpark as Europe. So it's not a homogeneous picture here either. Fertility decline cuts two ways. The future numbers of individuals are decreased, but for a given population size, because there are fewer children in a household, the future numbers of households are increased for a given number of people. Think of it as packaging the future population into smaller packages, smaller households. You have more households for a given number of people. And each household needs only one refrigerator, one television, one furnace, so the energy demand goes up as the household size goes down. And household size has fallen from 5.1 to 4.4 in the poor countries, 3.2 to 2.5 in the more developed countries. As fertility falls, the number of kin in a household may decline if people don't have multi-generational or consensual households. As longevity rises, the fraction of lifetime without children at home rises. Later marriage and more divorce increases the fraction of one-person household relative to two-person households, and rising wealth economics increases the feasibility of living independently, and culture encourages some people to live alone. What's the consequence? As household size drops from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the combined energy consumption per person goes up. So energetically, living in small households is much more expensive than living in large. And households account for 3/4 of the growth rate of energy consumption in the more developed regions, but population only accounts for 1/3. So this is a much better variable, households, than numbers of people. It would be unwise to draw far-reaching conclusions. Basically, use households, not population numbers only. And next is aging. Okay. In 1950, there were twice as many 0 to 4-year-olds as 60 plus. They were both 10% of the world in 2000. In 2050, 60 plus will be 3 times the number 0 to 4. Well, as household head age increases, the energy per capita, per person increases. Older people are home more, they heat the house more, they may have 2 households, they may desire a higher temperature. For a variety of reasons, energy use for residents increases dramatically with age. And that was the United States. This is China. This is age on this axis, energy use here. China and India, same story. In consideration of time, I'm going to stop there. I have some policy suggestions, and I will summarize them in 3 words. Education, John spoke about it. Contraception, John spoke about it. Smarter buildings. We need smarter buildings. Maybe Mark will talk about that. Thanks very much.
Elasticity requires a linearizing assumption as well. And so it has to be wrong. All right. Thank you. Joel, I appreciate it. We'll give you time to really finish when we have questions. Our next speaker is Mark Montgomery, Senior Associate with the Population Council's Poverty, Gender and Youth Program, Professor of Economics in the department, in the Economics Department at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. His research interests lie in 3 areas that are very important to us here: links between poverty and demographic behavior in the cities of developing countries, measurement of poverty and poverty dynamics using proxy variables, and how diffusion dynamics operates in the spread of fertility control and other innovative forms of demographic behavior. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Population and served from 1999 to 2003 as co-chair of its panel on urban population dynamics. Panel's report I recommend to you, Cities Transformed, Demographic Change and Its Implication in the Developing World, published by the National Academy Press in 2003. Welcome to the microphone.
Well, what a pleasure to have been invited and to follow John Bongartz and Joel Cohen in the list of speakers, and to look forward to the discussion of Hania Zlotnick. I will approach the topic from a slightly different angle. We're here this afternoon to speak about sustainable, thank you, I'll handle that, thanks. To speak about sustainable development and population. And so we should think sustainable against what pressures, against what counter pressures, and even more importantly, sustainable by whom? By what activities of governments, elements of civil society, international aid agencies. And the particular focus of my discussion will be on what we in the broader research community can do to help these units of government, aid agencies, and so forth. How do we proceed to assemble the evidence on urbanization, climate change, and the effects of climate change on the lives, the well-being of urban residents? There is, I hope to show you, to convince you, much that urgently needs to be done. There is too little that we are doing at present, in the social sciences in particular. I'll give an overview of the sorts of risks that are coming our way, discuss one particular climate-related risk, that is the risk of growing aridity. If the climate scientists are correct that dry zones will be getting drier, wet zones wetter, we'll be taking a look at the dry zones, and then we'll conclude. So as we look out ahead into the next decades, there are at least three very large trends that are going to be affecting the world's population and intertwining in various ways. One of those, which both John and Joel have mentioned, is a remarkable increase that we expect to occur in the numbers of residents in poor countries who live in cities and towns. Right? We are not yet prepared as fields of social science to help policymakers understand the full implications of this single trend. In addition, as we know, climate change itself is evidently underway. As we look ahead, the kinds of disasters which already can be recorded in the pages of our newspapers this year, last year, and the year before, are thought likely to increase in severity and possibly in frequency in the years to come. But we should also ask who, and in particular, which new actors are likely to appear on the scene, who will need to take a role in taking decisions about climate change adaptation, about dealing with the consequences of these changes. A more difficult trend to quantify, but one that in its way is, I think, as profound as these other two, is the trend to political decentralization. The emergence of new tiers of actors at intermediate and even rather low levels of government who are increasingly being asked by national governments to play a role in decision-making, in service provision, and so on. If you know anything about small cities in developing countries, you know that the best and brightest government bureaucrats do not often live there. They are instead in the capital cities and in the large cities. And so this new tier of decision makers is not yet very well equipped to grapple with the many complex decisions associated with urbanization and climate change of the years to come. It's helpful, I think, to broadly characterize climate-related risks into two general sorts. Those that have to do with sudden onset extreme weather events, flooding, whether from the coast or inland, with Thailand having just lived through one of the most remarkable inland flooding events of recent decades. Pakistan, practically every year now, living through much the same. Then there are the more gradual, gradually approaching, slower onset kinds of events, and aridity is one of those. These are not only demographic problems or climate problems, these are core problems in economic development. And both where disasters are concerned, as John and others know, there is occurring a kind of merger of international relief agencies, those concerned with disaster risk reduction, and other actors that have long been present in the economic development scene. So we're seeing, it's a very unusual historical moment, I think, that we're living through. What urban adaptation will consist of, in the main, are activities that are core development needs, core unmet needs in development that have been left unmet for decades in many cases. Investments in urban infrastructure, in sanitation, drainage, water supply, those needs have been left unaddressed for quite some time, leaving the urban poor in more precarious circumstances than they need to be left. But also there are new needs that have to do with giving forewarning, and protecting the poor urban populations who will be exposed to climate-related threats. It's important to remember that the national and certainly the local decision makers in poor countries do not have ready access to the kinds of information that we have here in Colombia about climate threats around the world. Often they must operate in a near vacuum of information, even about their own populations. And it is our job, broadly speaking, in the community, the world's community of researchers, to assemble, synthesize, and provide, to the extent that we can, at least the outlines of that sort of information, so that when policymakers do act, they act with reference to a base of evidence that we have helped assemble. So I'll ask about my own field, the field of demography, international demography. What is it that we should be doing to, in the long run, inform and help to guide climate change adaptation in the urban areas of poor countries? One way of informing that conversation is to help frame the questions so that the role of population is made more explicit than it perhaps otherwise would be. So in a PNAS paper from last year, we asked a question about emerging water scarcities affecting city residents of poor countries. The issue was if climate scientists are correct in saying that dry regions will be getting drier, if we look out 40 years, anticipate what is to come on the climate front, is that development going to expose more people to situations of water scarcity? Okay. Or is the greater factor the population growth that we expect to take place in the cities that are already situated in arid regions? Is that the way that more individuals will be exposed? And in our calculations, we found that demographic growth, city population growth, that is underway, that has its own momentum, as John has mentioned, is by far the greater factor in exposure to risk over the next 40 to 50 years. Beyond that, the analysis may change. That's one of the things that we in the demographic part of the social sciences can help contribute, a way of framing questions. We also have materials and methods to enter into the climate change conversation that we have not yet entered. We have ways of describing who is at risk from various climate-related threats. And by who, I mean, given that in situations of disaster, women and children are often far more vulnerable than men to loss of life, loss of health, and so forth. So the sex and age composition of the population is certainly relevant, as is its level of education and so on. Right? And we also, and both John and Joel have illustrated, we have a history of development of methods that have proven valuable in forecasting future population growth, and that may prove valuable in forecasting who will be exposed to climate-related risks. Okay. Now, we have not yet brought these methods, these materials, to bear. We have not yet, as a profession of demographers worldwide, succeeded in joining the conversation that has long been underway among physical scientists, geographers, and so on. And let me jump over this for a moment. To enter that conversation requires that a vast array of data be assembled. We have here just a few members of one research team engaged in this kind of activity. And That team, among the tasks facing that team, were to try to understand, looking across the developing world, where cities are located. You might think the answer to that question is simple. A coordinate, a GIS point, but in fact to describe in a useful way the spatial extents of cities, the areas that may be exposed to climate-related risks of one kind or another, is no simple undertaking. There are many methods being considered for this kind of task. No single method has proven to be dominant, but there are as well here a graph of comparing Bangladesh in 2009 with the lit areas, which you can probably barely perceive, shown on the left. These are images of nighttime lights, which is one measure that can be used to get an idea of the spatial extent of cities. On the right-hand side, outlined in red, were those same lights, but as seen about 10 to 12 years earlier. Right? So by comparing these two images, you can get from space, as it were, an image of the kinds of urbanization and changes in land covers, city spatial extents that has been underway in this period. But you can't, from these remote sources, understand what has changed in terms of population.
So looking at that graph, what do you see?
Well, I'm sorry?
So what's the difference?
The red areas, if you could, you may have to, it's a little difficult to see, I think, from you, are generally smaller than the images in the same place on the left. So there has been an expansion of urbanization in the sense that this is being measured. So a question that we demographers have to come to grips with is the question about population. Right? We can go a long way in multidisciplinary research teams using remotely sensed and other data sources, but at the end of the day, if we don't have measures of population, and not just numbers, but the composition of population to go along with those measures, we won't have succeeded in making a useful contribution to the climate change adaptation discussion. And so a question should come to everyone's mind, where else but population censuses do we find detailed, spatially specific information? That is, after all, the starting point. Full coverage to a good approximation of the population. Every census goes into the field with maps, with enumeration areas. Increasingly these days, those materials can be digitized and made into a spatial frame. Right? That is the possibility. The reality at the moment is that before certainly the current round of censuses, the 2010 round of censuses, that process did not advance very far in very many countries. Very few countries have even disaggregated their population census data and made the numbers available to lower levels of government where action would need to be taken on the basis of those numbers. Right? So the whole statistical machinery that operates in rich countries to field a census, disaggregate it, get the information out to those who need to make decisions based upon that information, that machinery is operating in very few poor countries at the moment. So we hope, looking forward, that the 2010 round of censuses will provide a fresh opportunity, will provide a set of resources that are essential to consider in the climate change adaptation arena. I think that the large issue here is where will the international leadership come from to assist developing country statistical offices in doing the disaggregation, the mapping, and compiling portraits of risk that will be needed in the next decades. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. For our final speaker, we have Hanya Slotnick, who recently retired from her appointment as Director of the Population Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the United Nations Secretariat. position she's held since February 2005, after working in the population division for 23 years. This is one of the ways in which I got to 121 years total. She is the 10th person to serve as director of the population division and the first woman to do so. During her long career at the division, she's worked in all the major areas of population research. In particular, she was chief of the mortality and migration section of the division from 1993 to 1999, and she directed the population estimates and projections section from 1999 to 2003. He served as assistant director from 2003 to 2005, overseeing the work on fertility, mortality and migration. Before joining the population division, she worked as research associate for the Committee on Population and Demography of the US National Research Council. It's been her distinguished career entirely in this field, and I welcome her to the microphone.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to come here and talk with, be part of this distinguished panel. All my friends have made important presentations, and I'm happy to say that almost all of them have used what I call still R numbers, the numbers produced by the Population Division of the United Nations, to illustrate what population is going to be in the future. So the title of my presentation is 7 billion and growing, what current population trends imply for the future of world population. But as I heard everyone else speak, I think I should change the title of my presentation to how to interpret the population projections of the population division. Because one problem we have is that the population division has been relatively good at projecting what the population of the world is going to be. And therefore, our numbers have become sort of the law of the land. Everyone who thinks about the future of population looks at the median variant of the population projections and assumes that we know what the future is going to be. And that's a problem, because in fact, none of us knows, and there is probably growing uncertainty about what the future of population will be in the future, especially if we go 100 years into the future. So what I want you to take out of this lecture, and I start with that message, is do not trust our numbers. You need to look behind them and understand what are the assumptions and what do they mean in terms of possible variability in the future. So the first thing is I have a slide like John's and everyone else's showing you how the population has grown only since 1750. I'm not sure that we really know what happened in year zero, but there are numbers out there for year zero, and it shows that the growth of the population really accelerated very much after around 1950, as John said, because of first mortality decline, a very fast mortality decline, and if the population hasn't grown as much as it could have, it's because fertility has declined also. The next slide shows how the growth rate of the world population has changed over the same period. And as Joel presented, the change of the growth rate has been very different from the growth of the population. Because as you see in the 1700s, 1800s, the world population was growing at a modest, still very importantly positive growth rate of about 0.5% per year. But after the beginning of the 20th century, the growth rate started accelerating, reaching a peak at the end of the 60s at 2.1% per year. And since then it has dropped precipitously, but it's still, the population of today is growing at a very high rate of 1.1% per year, which is double the one that we had in the previous centuries and much higher than the history of the world population has had. Now, the way I try to see the world population is that it's important, as Joe said, to look at the pieces of the world. Because John already mentioned that many people have been talking about the disaster that the world is going to face because many countries are going to have a declining population. And that's because the highest percentage of the world population today lives in countries that have already very low fertility. Fertility that is so low that it's unlikely that the generations will reproduce themselves. That happens when every woman has less than one daughter that gets to the age of reproduction. That's the low fertility. And we have 42% of the population of the world living in those countries, and those countries amount to 74% of all the countries in the world. They include China, among others, most of Europe, and several of the other developed countries. But they also include countries like Tunisia, Lebanon, Brazil at this moment. Many of the developing countries are moving in that direction. Then we have the intermediate fertility countries, countries where today the fertility is still allowing them to keep on growing, but not that much. I've defined them as those where women are having between 1 and 1.5 daughters per woman, but daughters that survive to the age of reproduction. And 40% of the population is living in those countries. They amount to 65 countries, and they include India, I think Indonesia, several of the big countries of the world, and most of the developing world. And there are just 18% of the population, there is just 18% of the population today that live in what I could call the high fertility countries, where women are having at least 1.5 daughters per woman, sometimes more. And they amount to 58 countries, and so they don't look too bad, because it's only 18% of the world population. And we have the problem of the compositional effects here. Now let's look at the map of where these countries are. The high fertility are the red countries. They're mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but not exclusively. You have them also in the Yemen, the Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Philippines. The Latin America has Bolivia and certain countries in Central America, also Haiti that doesn't show there. So it's not only Africa that has countries that are growing very fast. That's a very important message to send. The yellow countries, and notice that the United States is among them, just barely, but it's among them, are countries that still are going to have a growing population. They're the intermediate fertility countries. And you see the green countries are the ones that have very low fertility and where it's expected that their population will decline in the future. As you will see, there's declines every place. One thing that I found amazing after I had divided the world into those 3 groups is that when I went and looked at the history in the past, those 3 groups aligned themselves in very different ways according to their fertility, mortality, and migration. Fertility and mortality. That means that these are the trends in life expectancy in the different groups of countries. You see the high fertility countries have very low life expectancy and have always had it since we're measuring it. The low fertility countries have higher life expectancy and always had it. In the intermediate have intermediate life expectancy. I want to emphasize that there was no reason to have this differentiation happen, because we have countries like China that was very underdeveloped very recently, that is in the low fertility countries, and yet when I get the averages, they align themselves in different ways. The same thing happens for fertility, and here what you ought to notice is that the high fertility countries started by having much higher fertility than even the intermediate fertility countries. They maintained it until the late 80s or 90s, and it's only then that you start seeing a slight decline. And the decline has been much lower than what happened in the other 2 groups of countries. Also, amazingly, the low fertility countries had a big decline, and the biggest decline is because mostly of the drop of fertility in China. Now, this is what shows you how we project the fertility of countries, because it's fertility in the future that drives mostly the population growth that is projected for the different countries. Here we have all the population of the world, and the main ideas John presented is that we're projecting fertility to decline in every country of the world, and the projections now are made via a model that generates 100,000 paths, I think, for each country via a probabilistic model, and then takes the central path, and that's what we call our median projection. And what I'm showing here is the median projection for the different groups of countries we're looking at. And you see that all of them are going towards around 2 children per woman at the end of the projection period, 2100. But the high fertility countries remain well above the 2.2 children per woman during most of the projection period. That doesn't happen in the median projection with the intermediate or the low. The low are already below replacement level. And what you see is that we're projecting fertility to recuperate, to go up in the future very slowly, but it goes up. And for the intermediate fertility countries, we project it to go down. So it's important because we cannot say that we're projecting fertility to go down in every country of the world. The ones that have very low fertility have a fertility that goes up in the median variant. Otherwise, they would decline faster. Now, with those projections in the median variant, this is the amount of people that every group of countries is adding every year. And you see that for the world as a whole, the projection is the amount of people that are being added is going to decline according to the median variant quite drastically, though it remains high as an addition to the world until around the 1950s, adding between 80 million now to 40 million per year. But the important thing to notice is that since the low fertility countries go below 0 additions, that means they are having a shrinking population around 2030, all the growth of the population of the world is going to happen at first in the intermediate and the high fertility countries, and eventually only in the high fertility countries. So it's that 18% of the population that is growing today with high rates that is essentially moving the growth of the population of the future in this median variant. Now, I want to show the projection that we made for the high fertility countries in terms of the fertility. We have the 3 variants that John presented, the low variant, the medium, that is the yellow line, the high variant, the white line. Those are the variants that people usually use in order to show what maybe would be the variation in the future. And they are variants that we've created not probabilistically, but thinking of giving you a recipe. If the medium variant has a certain fertility, the high variant maintains the fertility half a child above, and the low variant half a child below the medium. So that we can tell politicians or normal people like you, well, if the difference in fertility is only half a child and it's maintained for long enough, you can see what effects it's going to have on population growth. But we have other variants that are useful. And the one that I showed here is the one where we keep the fertility and the mortality of each country constant for all the projection period. And what is important to note is by keeping the fertility and the mortality constant in the high fertility countries, which are the ones that have relatively high mortality today, you see that the fertility of those countries goes up. It doesn't remain constant. Why? Because the ones that are having higher fertility are getting more people that are reproducing even more. So there is where you have the exponential effect of population growth, the more than exponential effect of population growth. The same thing is I want to show you for the intermediate fertility countries, and what I think is very important to remark here is that the no change variant shows you that even with these variations of composition, in the no change variant we get really constant fertility over the period, because the fertility of these countries tends to be so low already that you're not getting a possible explosion. So that 40% of the population that is still growing, even if nothing were done to it, if it were remain as of today, it will still grow, but it's likely not to explode. For the high fertility countries, now I show you the increments per year with these 4 variants. The low fertility projection takes them to even reductions of the population towards the end of the projection period. The medium keeps them on growing, but the growth moderates very much during the projection period, as I had shown you before. The high keeps the growth growing, but again, it's a moderate growth. But if nothing were to change, and I'm not telling you that this would happen, but it's important to keep that in mind, you will see the rapid exponential growth of the increments of the population every year. That is a very different thing from what is projected for the intermediate fertility countries. Here, look, the constant variant gives you even lower increments than the high. The high is even with a half a child more, is exaggerating what the constant would give you. So that means the potential for growth in the world population is mostly, not entirely, but restricted to these 18% of the world population that lives in the countries with very high fertility. And these countries tend to be the poorest of the world, and not only the poorest, the ones that have serious social, political, economic problems that are preventing them from really taking off in the development process. This is the same graph as before, but I wanted to scale it to the same level as the high fertility countries so that you see that compared to the high fertility countries where we're going to add at the end of the projection period about 250,000 people per year, the intermediate fertility countries that include India would not be adding a lot in the same scale. Now, this is what happens with the world, the same graphs, but now for the world. We'll put everything together, and you see that in the constant variant, the world and the high are very similar, partly because the high fertility countries are taking over in the growth for both of them. This one would be the same thing, but for the medium variant. So the previous one is the constant variant that shows you that the low fertility countries in the constant variant just start dropping very quickly, but the high fertility countries were very fast and they moved the world. In the medium variant, you see a control of the growth of the population, and those are the graphs, I mean the projection that everyone uses. But we might not be right in using that because there's still quite a bit of potential for growth in the high fertility countries. Now, I have a few examples of countries in the three groups where we have produced not only the normal projections, these ones that are half a child above and half a child below, that are just the recipes, and that appear here as the green line and the white line for Nigeria, showing you how much the population would be projected to grow to 2100. But also we had calculated the actual probabilistic 95% confidence intervals for this country. And what's important to note in the case of Nigeria is that these 95 confidence intervals are much wider than the +5, -5 projections. That means for most of the high fertility countries, this is what happens. The likely future that we project could even be outside the bounds of the +5, -5. And you see that the path of population growth is not symmetrical with respect to fertility. The possible reductions of growth are much lower when fertility is low than the possible increases when fertility is high. So it's another example of why these countries are not out of the woods yet. They have still an issue about population growth. Very different is the projections for India, where the 95% intervals almost coincide with the +5, -5. Plus half a child and less than half a child. The high and the low are almost coincident with the 95 confidence intervals. So we're more likely to be correct in projecting the intermediate fertility countries within those boundaries, not the median level. John said something that is, I think, technically wrong. The median variant is not the most likely path. There is no single path that is most likely. It's the central path. The likelihood is found within those intervals. Anywhere there, we could have the population. Lastly, for China, it's interesting to note that the upper and lower confidence intervals, the 95% of, are much narrower than our +5, -5 fertility, because the +5, look how strange a population growth it gives you. It's really forcing the situation in terms of the trends that we have seen in China. So that means it seems likely that the low fertility countries will maintain low fertility, the intermediate fertility countries, even if they don't go down much faster than today, they would not grow that much, but there's still a chance that the high fertility countries would make the population continue rising. And they themselves can see a population explosion, which is what they've been experimenting more than other countries up to today. This is the final projections. I'm only presenting the high and the low variant. The low variant could take us to 6.2 billion, the high variant to 16 or 15.8 billion. So that means even with these non-probabilistic projections, you see how much variability there could be in the future depending on where countries go in terms of the fertility. And last thing is to show the same thing, or to emphasize what John has mentioned. That one thing that really differentiates the different groups of countries, again, the low fertility is in red, the intermediate fertility in yellow, and the high fertility in green. What this graph is showing is the percentage of women who are using contraception. And you see that although there's great variation among every group of countries, essentially the green countries are much lower than the yellow or the red. That means the high fertility countries are having a lot lower use of contraception than the others. There's a lot of debate among economists and among other people about whether family planning is really important and whether that can make the change. Maybe it's not absolutely clear that family planning by itself, accessibility to family planning by itself may make people use it. But I can tell you that it's unlikely that people will stop having children without family planning, because they need to have a way of controlling their fertility. And both men and women have to have access to the means of doing so. And the most shocking part of the presentation is this last map, where what we're showing is the percentage of countries, the countries in yellow, all the countries where the international aid devoted to family planning declined by more than 50% between 1996 and 2006. This is not all the money that goes to family planning, because governments themselves, national governments themselves, are also contributing to pay for the family planning programs. But the international aid to family planning, which is crucial for many of the very poor, least developed countries that have high fertility, instead of increasing, declined not by a little, but by more than 50% over this period. There is a tendency now to pick up the tab a little bit more, but part of the reason why we have seen a very slow decline of fertility in the least developed countries, which are mostly the high fertility countries, is partly because of this decline in funding and attention to family planning. So if you want to get more information about all these things, you can go to the Population Division's website at unpopulation.org. Thank you very much.
So could I ask the panelists to come to the little table out front? And I'm going to open the floor for questions, but I'm going to take moderator's option and ask the first question. And in doing so, express my, surprise, or I thought all of you would mention something that none of you mentioned, at least explicitly, and perhaps all of you implicitly, the notion that I see in almost every little textbook, and I know I even have slides on this myself, the thing called the demographic transition. Is that too unsophisticated a notion nowadays? Is it something that belonged in the previous century, or is it so assumed that it's like Newton's law of gravity? I don't have to explain why I'm not floating in the air. This is something that is understood. Is it still valid? Can I ask Joel to begin answering that? You knew I would.
John, are you prepared to, I mean, I'm happy to address it, but perhaps John.
Okay, whoever.
Well, demographic transition is sort of a very generalized picture of what happens to birth and death rates over the course of centuries. So in very poor traditional societies, birth rates and death rates are both high, and the difference between them is the growth rate. So the reason why population grows is there are more births than death. So in the 16th and 17th century, the pre-transition countries, birth rates and death rates were high and growth rates were near zero. The first thing that happens in that transition is that the death rate declines. Nutrition improves, public health measures, etc. The death rate declines, but the birth rate stays the same. And the difference between them therefore arises and the growth rate accelerates. For most of the world, that pre-transition period lasted until the 50s and 60s. The next phase of the transition is that, so you have high rates in birth rate, the death rate drops, the birth rate stays the same, then the birth rate declines, and the death rate stays the same. So the growth rate starts declining, and at the end of the transition, population growth is near zero again, but birth rates and death rates are low. Now, this general picture applies to every country in the world if you look at it for long enough. But the differences are substantial and important. In Europe, for example, the transition was spread out over centuries. And between the beginning and the end of the transition, the population multiplied by a factor of 5. In contemporary African countries, the transition is still underway. So most African countries are sort of in the middle. They have high birth rates and low death rates. So the growth rate is at peak. But if you take the UN projections, then over the transition that is expected to be completed, say 100 years from now in Africa, the total population size will have grown by 40 or 50-fold. So if you take Europe over the transition, grows only 5-fold, which is very large. Over the transition that we now see underway in Africa, it could be as much as 45-fold increase in population. Now, why didn't we mention this? Well, it's a story that probably should have been there, yeah, but sorry, next time we'll do it.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it was implicit in everybody's talk. In preparing my thoughts for this, I read, of course, the source of all important information articles in The Economist, which repeatedly talk about the slow demographic transition in Africa and how important it is for overall world population and why is it slow and what are the factors.
One important thing, though, there's nothing automatic about the transition. In other words, if a country's death rate declined, that doesn't mean that the birth rate decline will automatically follow. Okay, and that's why there are such differences between countries in their transitions.
Oh.
Could I add something? Yes, the big question is that the transition is an empirical fact that has been noticed in many countries. And demographers used to think that the transition was going to end when you got to zero growth. That means when people were having just as many children as they needed to have for generations to reproduce themselves. We have been surprised by the fact that in many populations, as I showed you, people are having fewer children than they need to have in order for generations to reproduce themselves. That's an important point. But then the other question is, are there going to be many societies where people are going to keep on having more children than the ones they need to have to reproduce themselves? We did have examples like Uruguay and Argentina, which are countries that they were almost European. They reduced their fertility very early, but they have not yet gone below replacement fertility as far as I know. Israel is another example. They're small populations, no big problem. But what if Africa stays at 4 children per woman forever? I mean, we think that you all environmentalists and everyone else will find ways in which the population will control itself by other means, the Malthusian effects. But if that doesn't happen, it creates problems for these populations that are already having the the issue of not being able to develop very fast because of constraints.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll let other people ask questions. You had your hand up first.
Could you stand up? We can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Do you still need me to stand with the mic?
No.
Okay. Just a quick preface before my question. My name is Alice Labrie, and I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. I've served in Turkey, Oman, Sweden, and the U.S. mission to the UN, and I live in Harlem. And the carbon emissions are a problem, but I'm more worried about the issue of the impact on my tax base and quality of life. And my last quick comment, I was at a talk where a Chinese-American author, last name I think is Li, and she wrote a book called What Can the U.S. Learn from China? So my question was, I thought the U.S. could learn from China about the population control. Well, that didn't go over very well. So what is the panel's comment? I mean, what are we going to do? What can we do, us citizens, to control population?
The total fertility rate in China began to decline about a decade before the one-child policy was put into place. I wasn't there at the time, so I can't answer the question, how come? Well, if you look at the plot of the total fertility rate as a function of time in China, there's virtually no visible effect of the imposition of the one-child policy. It goes straight down across that event. The gentleman to my right, John Bongartz, showed that one could have achieved the demographic goals of the one-child policy by delaying the age of marriage and insisting on a spacing between two children. John will correct me if I get this wrong, of about 5 years, which would have avoided the super fast aging that results from a single child and would have avoided the sex-selective abortions of girl children on a massive scale. It would have had other virtues too. My own take on it is that we do not need and should not even consider coercive population control, a term I never use. I see you smacking your head in disgust and disbelief, but I respectfully differ with you. I don't. Khanya showed us that 42% of the world already is living in countries with below replacement fertility. What we do need is much improved quality of and access to education for all boys and girls, and access to contraception, and jobs, and cultural change that gives people opportunities to alternatives to childbearing as a way to bring meaning into their lives. So I know there are people who take a hard line. We need to stop those people from having so many children. I think that is a sad mistake. It's short-sighted, it's ineffective, it's not humane, and it won't work. I can't hear you.
Well, I would generally second what Joel has just said. There is an awful lot of work to be done in helping families adhere to the pace of childbearing and the number of children that they themselves say that they wish to have. There is, as John has demonstrated, there's substantial unmet need for contraception in the populations of poor countries. Those policymakers in those countries are often quite fearful of the pace, what they perceive to be the rapid pace of urban growth, and yet they have not generally put investments into urban voluntary family planning programs, which would be one of the surest and most effective ways of slowing that rate of urban growth. So there's plenty of work to be done in helping families meet the goals that they themselves enunciate without resorting to coercion. And I think, as Joel has said, coercion is not likely to succeed in any event, and the human costs of applying it, we've seen populations react against those sorts of measures time and again. So that's not on, as far as I'm concerned.
Could I just add to the response, just at the risk of introducing a few facts into the conversation? In 2008, there were 208 million pregnancies. 86 million of those were unintended worldwide, 41%. These unintended pregnancies resulted in 33 million unplanned births. In the United States and Canada, 48%, roughly 1 in 2 pregnancies were unintended, resulting in 1.7 million unintended births. So let's not try for the hard problems when we have some easy ones to solve. If we helped the 41% of unintended pregnancies worldwide, or the 48% in the United States, we could improve the welfare of the women, the male partners, and the children who are the chief victims of unintended pregnancy.
Yeah, just one footnote to this issue. I agree with everything was said. Coercive measures have actually been counterproductive in the following way. As I showed earlier, in the 1990s, international attention to population and family planning declined, funding declined, population dropped off the international agenda, and one of the factors that is responsible for that is the fear of coercion. In 1994, there was a very important international conference, and there were an overwhelming number of countries said that we do not want coercion, and they're fearful of population control, basically a demographically driven objective of the government that ignores the well-being of individuals. So there was a shift from demographic views and perspectives on population in the 70s and 80s to a woman-focused effort in the 90s. But that at the same time meant that demographic issues fell off the agenda, and this is one of the backlash against the coercion that occurred in China and for a brief period in India. This is totally unnecessary because we have a win-win situation. We can address the needs of women, and we can, by doing so, help communities and countries improve their well-being. So there's no need for population control or coercion.
How does the trend toward urbanization and the development of megacities affect the metrics of the global population growth?
Well, let me, we all have the impression, I would say, that urbanization in poor countries will take the form of population growth in cities that are already enormous. Megacities are conventionally defined to be cities with 10 million residents or more. And so, you know, to wrap one's mind around that image, clearly very difficult to imagine a future of that kind. What we have often overlooked is the fact that today and for the foreseeable future, the great majority of urban residents in poor countries live in much smaller places than this, in places that are under 1 million, under 500,000, under 100,000. These are the places where the majority of the urban residents live. Those are the places expected to see the population increases of the future, along with megacities. So megacities attract, seize, and even dominate our attention, sometimes for good reasons, because the problems they present are, one could say, are of a qualitatively different order in terms of scale, complexity, and so forth. But we too often overlook the cities where most urban residents live. We think too seldom of the levels of poverty, the levels of services, and the levels of management in those cities, which are all, as a rule, lower than is the case in the largest cities. So somehow we've got to force into our mind's eye an image of these small and intermediate size urban places and devise a place for them in economic development strategies, including those for sustainable development.
Just to quantify a little bit, about 10% of the urban population lives in megacities, a little bit under, and about half of the urban people in the world live in cities of 500,000 or fewer, 500,000 or fewer. I take this information from Mark's book, Cities Transformed.
Yes,
Just one other thing, Connie, excuse me. You can download the complete PDF of this book for free from National Academies Press, and I recommend that you do that. It's a real goldmine of information, and it's free.
Okay, and yes, we and the population division, and not I anymore, but we're the ones that do the accounting of cities. Mark is trying to nowadays do better by putting the geography in the cities, which we don't put in. But as I tell everyone, you can count the megacities of this world. We tell you, I don't know, there are 28 something, but you cannot count the number of cities that are having populations below 500,000. There are too many. We don't know them by name and address. We know the other ones by name and address. We don't know those. And half of the population, the urban population, is in those cities. Now, if you imagine how urbanization is happening, it's happening at the bottom. And very often, you know, what happens, a rural area creates a little town somewhere that is the market town. It starts attracting more people. Eventually it has a school. It's the cabecera where they have the government, and they call that urban. But that is not really urban. That is slightly less than rural. And what the book that Mark wrote is fantastic about is showing that there is a hierarchy of services and a hierarchy of well-being with the size of urban settlement. The rural areas in every place of the world are doing much worse than the small cities, than the medium-sized cities, than the big cities, than the megacities. So it makes a lot of sense for everyone to go to megacities because they have the best services. But it would be impossible and stupid for everyone to go to these monsters. Besides, the other thing he showed is that megacities don't grow by putting more people in there. It's only Manhattan that probably does it. Every other city grows by expanding. And if New York is a megacity, according to us, it's because it's not Manhattan or it's not just New York City per se. New York City per se has 8 million people. It doesn't qualify even as a megacity. In order for us to have it as a megacity, it's because we count half of Connecticut, half of New Jersey, and a bit of Philadelphia, because one is considering the whole urban agglomeration that is working in a way together. So those things have to be borne in mind when you're considering urbanization. Urbanization is a very complex process of the organization of the economy, the space, and the people. And it cannot be summarized by just thinking of everything is going to be like Mumbai or Mexico City or New York. That's why we demographers only touch it at the very top. But it's important to have this vision of great heterogeneity in the urban areas of the world.
My name is Jairo Garcia. I am with the Sustainability Management Program at the Earth Institute. And a few years ago, I read an article in The Economist. The editor of The Economist published this article stating that actually growth population is good for human civilization. And I canceled my subscription. Because according to what I have seen and what I have studied, population growth is correlated to depletion of natural resources. But apparently these technologies economists believe that the more people, the merrier. So perhaps they haven't received the memo. So what do you think about the relationship between depletion of natural resources and population growth, if there is any? And how do you address these technologies, economists, that believe that the more the merrier?
Yes, we've been struggling with that because very powerful economists forever have been saying that, look, the countries that are growing the fastest or that have a lot of population, especially they have a lot of population because they need a market. So countries in Africa should grow more because they need a market. Well, but it's not a question of just having a market. You have to have people that have purchasing power, and what you're having in Africa is lots of people that cannot even find jobs. So you know what's happening in the developing world. The labor force that is working in the formal sector and is more or less protected is relatively small in proportion to the big labor force that the countries have. And if really the world needed a lot more people to do much better, we've already had that population explosion that has happened. And in many places, especially in Africa, where the populations have grown a lot, what you see is that it's being an impediment for economic growth. You start seeing it from the very beginning of creating a labor force that is more educated. They're having great trouble keeping up with providing the services they need in terms of education for their people. So there's many arguments to be made on a case-by-case basis. It's not easy to make it at the global level about why rapid population growth is slowing the possible economic and social development of these countries. But it's true that many leaders of these countries do not understand this or buy this, and it's part of why we think they haven't been putting enough attention to thinking about how to convince people that having smaller families is better for them.
My name is Richard Zimmerman. I'm a follow-on on my colleague's question. I'm in the Sustainable Management Program as well. In your models for forecasting fertility rates, and I see the decline. I was wondering the component, if you have it, of the economic component in it. And if you have a scenario which we could play out here where actually global economy really starts to go south and there's a depletion resource at the same time, so say natural resources prices rise, could that cause actually fertility rates to rise in many of the countries, including developing worlds?
I just want to clarify, what do you mean by going south? Do you mean having a problem, or do you mean moving to the south?
Yes,
countries of
more
the
of a,
global south?
yeah, I mean, exactly. That's, not as good, because I know that some, in some economic forecasting, we may expect the world to be better in the future in some aspects, and this is, we may have peaked in that right now, so it's going to be tougher times globally. So
the answer is no. We have enough problems projecting the fertility and mortality of the world by itself than if we were to start thinking about the future of the economy in 100 years to then project fertility. There's a lot more consistency and inertia in the population trends than in the economic trends. So we do not take into account at all possible environmental constraints or economic constraints or anything. It's just what has happened in the past that guides us for what's happening in the future. And the reason that the fertility trends in every country of the world are projected to keep on going down is precisely because of that. We're using as basis for projection what has happened in most countries in the past, and we've seen in most countries a big decline in fertility. So that's what is informing the future decline of every other country. But that's where you have to ask yourself the question, will it happen every place in the same way?
Question for Professor Cohn. You said that CO2 emissions grew faster than the population. I think you said that. My question is, why do the lower developing countries have a higher carbon emission when they would have fewer cars, they have less machinery, they're less industrialized? So where does the CO2 come from?
Yes, what the data that I showed show that the rate of increase in carbon emissions was much higher in the less developed countries. The absolute level per person is still a fraction of what it is in the rich countries. But the aggregate production, which is the number of people times the per capita, in China has already exceeded that in the United States. So there are three different things going on, and you got to keep them straight. One is the rate of growth of emissions. The reason that's growing most rapidly in the poor countries is that they are industrializing. China is building coal-fired and many other power plants because they need the energy to produce stuff to sell to us. Rate of growth, per capita amount. The carbon emissions per person in the United States are on the order of 20 tons, which is about 3, 4, 5 times the global average. In India, it is much, much, much lower. That's the per capita level. And then there's the aggregate emissions, and I believe the figures are China's first, we are second, Russia is third because they are very inefficient, carbon inefficient producers. I think India is fourth. I don't remember the ones after that. So the aggregate, the per capita, and the growth rate are three different things, and they're all different. The growth rate is highest in the poor countries because they are industrializing.
Okay. If female literacy rates are the primary determinant of desired family size, what could be done in those countries where there aren't the educational resources, or they're very poor, they don't have good schooling? What can be done in those countries to change desired family size?
Well, when everyone starts having children, although we go and ask them how many children do you want, usually people don't have the 5 at the same time. They have 1 at a time, maybe 2, but 1 at a time, okay? So when people are deciding to get pregnant or not to get pregnant, it's a decision 1 at a time. And very often, if you do tell women that it would be better not to have a child every year, not to be pregnant every year, they buy that idea, no matter how many children they want to have at the end of their lives. And that is what has happened in the countries that have been very poor, very illiterate, and where people have had services to go and get to women just after they had a child and tell them how to take care of the child, how to make sure that the child survives, and also provide for them contraception in order for them not to get pregnant immediately. As long as they increase birth intervals, as John was saying, they might still reach their 5 children eventually, but that already helps fertility to go down and for them to get comfortable with the sense that they can control how many children they want to have. Because what we're saying is we pass from a condition where they think they have to have as many children as they will have because they cannot control it, and the idea that they have control over their own bodies. And usually it's by this process that they change their wishes. Because if not, it's futile to say, I want 5 or I want 20. If you don't have the means of controlling it, it doesn't matter what they tell you that they want. We have seen that many of the fertility declines that happened in the past happened in populations that did not have very high fertility. And if you're thinking of Africa today and the people that are already having children, you cannot wait till you educate them because you're not going to educate them. They're already having the children today. They haven't had education. So what they need is to give them the means of at least planning their pregnancies.
I had the privilege to go to Ghana in 2009, and I was in villages, and I would ask through a translator, so how many children do you want to have? And they want to have a big family. It's a service to God, as many as God will give me. And so I don't know, I think they would look at me funny if I offered them contraceptives, like, why should I use contraceptives?
Because you're not going to give it for them not to have 5, exactly. Okay? That's what we're talking about. You don't tell them that you have to have 2. What you tell them is if you have 1 today and you immediately get pregnant because another thing that has happened in all these countries is they used to have methods of extending the birth intervals by breastfeeding for a very long time. As they modernize, they have cut that. So if you make sure that they understand that having a child in 3 years' time is better than having a child in 1 year time because they can take care of this baby now, that's how they start seeing that they have an option of not having 5 or 10 or whatever, and they might change their views over time. Maybe they end up having the 5. That's fine. It's their decision. It's not a question of telling anyone how many children they ought to have. It's giving them the means so that they can control their fertility and eventually be able to actually make decisions on that fertility. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many children I want if I don't have a means of controlling it. So, and what we have seen is that that has worked in all types of societies. You don't wait first for people to change their mind and then start giving them the means. The other thing that I want to add about the case of China is that there is a question about whether China really needed to have imposed that policy to get the decline they got. First of all, everyone knows about the one-child family, but the policy is not one child. The policy has forever been that people in rural areas could have 2 children. And at the beginning of this policy, 80% of the Chinese population lived in rural areas. And what we have today is that China still has a fertility of about 1.6, 1.7. No one knows exactly what fertility they have, but it's not 1. And we have Hong Kong on the other side that never had a policy, and where the fertility is 0.9 children per woman. Okay? So there you see one of the important things that Chinese origin populations all over the world have had in a very rapid decline of fertility without policies that have forced people to decide to have very few children. There's, as you say, something in the culture that promotes having few children. That's what we think. It's possible, and that's the question, whether there's something intrinsic in the African cultures that will keep it high. We don't think so because we've seen South Africa already have a very low fertility, but maybe the Western African states that are French Francophone speaking might be different. We will live and see, but we know that without giving people the chances of having the means of controlling their fertility, you won't get there, because it won't be by praying that you get there. Okay?
Just one last comment on this. John Cleland looked at the high fertility countries who began a fertility transition decade by decade. In the 1950s, all of the countries who began a drop in fertility had high female literacy. As the decades passed, the fraction of female literacy in the countries that were then entering a decline in fertility dropped. So the MATLAB experiment, which John talked about, was in a population that didn't have high fertility. Now, I happen to think that... Excuse me, thank you. Literacy is important, education is important, but not because it's a condom in disguise. It's important for the quality of life and the choices that people have. You have to go the route that Hania described of getting to people who have just had a child and offering them a means to improve their life and the life of their child for the next few years. And that way the idea sinks in. Can I make one other comment on the urbanization question? We expect about 2.5 billion additional urban people between now and 2050. 2.5 billion is 2,500 millions. The number of weeks between now and 2050, 40 years times 50 weeks is 2,000. It means that the cities of the developing countries have to accommodate an additional 1 million people every 5 days from now to 2050. And the question that I want to leave with you is, are we investing adequately in the engineering and design and construction technology for the cities to make those cities humanly habitable? And it was said that most people are going to live in slums of those added people. Does it have to be that way, or could we take a forward-looking, energy-efficient, human-respecting approach to designing those cities? 1 million additional people every 5 days.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience, even those who have already left, because there were many for a while. This is just about the best of these sessions I've been to, including ones that I've spoken at myself. So I very much thank the speakers for their presentations, for their answers to their questions. This has been extraordinary. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating.